In 1968, Douglas Engelbart of Stanford Research Institute demonstrated a groundbreaking computer system that included the computer mouse, video conferencing, teleconferencing, hypertext, word processing, and a collaborative real-time editor. It was called, quite dramatically, the mother of all demos. Also, NASA's Apollo 8 mission orbited the moon. Andrew Garve's thriller The Long Short Cut was the first electronically printed book, and Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce founded Intel. It was a big year.
You already know my name. And you can see that I'm a machine.
I'm afraid. I'm afraid.
Welcome to the Final Girls podcast. I'm Anna Bogutska, your podcast host. I'm a critic and the author of Feeding the Monster, and in this series of the Final Girls podcast, I'm journeying through the intersections of horror and technology, from the first robots of the silent era to the most recent AI villains. Over the next few months on this show, we are diving into the world of machines. Every episode, I'm joined by a guest to discuss a film or two and how it captures our fears and anxieties around technology and the place it holds in our lives. It's only the fourth episode of the series, and we're already into one of the big ones, Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. For anyone who's not seen 2001, I'll make an attempt to summarize it, even though this does not do justice to the film at all, and you should all stop this episode and go watch it immediately, no matter what time of day it is. But let's go. On a mysterious mission in outer space, an astronaut's computer system, HAL 9000, begins to display increasingly strange behavior, leading up to a tense showdown between man and machine. HAL 9000 is probably one of the most influential villainous AIs in pop culture history, and to tackle one of the greatest, most revered, and most influential science fiction films ever made, no small feat, I'm joined by my good friend Ruby McGuigan to discuss the fandom around Kubrick, attempt to discuss the meaning of 2001, and join me in a passionate defense of HAL 9000, who has never done anything wrong ever. And please be warned, this episode is full of spoilers and irreverence. Remember to subscribe and review the podcast if you enjoyed this episode and indeed this series so far, and you can see what other films I'm going to be covering over on our Letterboxd page, which is linked in the show notes. You can also let me know your thoughts about what you think the ending of 2001 really means by dropping me a line on hello@thefinalghost.co.uk. And if you wish to support the podcast and prevent the machines from taking over my life, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/thefinalgirls. And with all that said, please enjoy our conversation about 2001 A Space Odyssey.
Let me put it this way, Mr. Raymer. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made. No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. So I am constantly occupied. I am putting myself to the fullest possible use, which is all I think that any conscious entity can ever hope to do.
I really love, I really love you, and I really love having you do this.
But I was like, is there going to be an end to that sentence?
There is an end to that sentence. The end to that sentence is that I'm particularly giggly about having you talk about technology on a podcast when you're
it's pretty funny.
It's really funny because for listeners who don't know you as much as I do, it's my privilege and I'm keeping that to myself. You dislike technology immensely.
Yeah, I think in many ways I'm the perfect person to talk about this film. I barely have an internet connection. So I've never met a Siri. I don't know an Alexa. It's a foreign territory to me. Everything in 2001 feels very space age to me, a Luddite.
Well, so I'm going to ask you what I'm asking everyone as a little icebreaker for the season.
Okay.
And as a a committed Luddite. Do you remember, Ruby, what was the first piece of technology you owned?
I'm yet to acquire any. I've got a watch. Does that count? No, I'm kidding. I do. I have an iPhone, gentle listeners.
I've heard of this rumor.
Yeah. So I think my first piece of technology, I guess, I mean, you could be facetious and say like a fork or something. But I think the one that says tech to me the most from my childhood is I had a Tamagotchi. Which I was obsessed with, and I think it's incredible that humans, one of the first things they did with sort of sophisticated technology was make something poop.
I really thought you were going somewhere else with that, but you are correct.
Yeah, it's good. I loved that Tamagotchi, and the other thing I really loved in my childhood was I had a Walkman.
Oh yes,
yeah, that was very obsessed with, and then a Discman when I was about 11. And I can date it to that because I remember that I used to turn it all the way up to like the loudest volume in my shitty tinny headphones in the back of my parents' car and listen to Linkin Park. And I feel like they definitely heard every word.
This is when I knew that I probably did not have my finger on a pulse and was not going to make a lot of money in Silicon Valley, was when I fully went to bat for the mini disc.
Oh yeah, that was a misstep.
Yeah, my classmates were getting the first gen of iPods, and I was like, "No, lads."
So I still have a first gen iPod.
Do you?
A classic, but I can't use it because I don't have any of the cables.
Oh, people are refurbing them online now.
It's refurbed.
Yeah.
But you also need like a hacked version of iTunes from 2004 or whatever.
Someone can do that for you, I'm sure.
I'm not interested in meeting that person.
That's rude.
It is rude. Yeah.
You could probably sell it on eBay for a good chunk of change, though.
It was a gift from my dad. He thought he was being cute and nostalgic. You know how parents are when they're like, "This was a thing when you were small. You must still want it." Yeah, fair. Yeah, less said about that, the better.
But that is very cute. Did your Tamagotchi survive?
Yeah, actually, yeah.
Still alive to this day?
No, so there became a point, like I do with all creatures in my life, where I got bored and just, I don't know, let it rust in a corner somewhere. But I was quite diligent about feeding it and cleaning up its poop, which are the only two activities that I can recall with Tamagotchi. I'm sure there were others, but those are the ones I can remember.
We have the unenviable task of being two women talking about Stanley Kubrick on the internet.
I know. Well, so I don't know if you might want to cut this section out, but I think it's interesting that we'd originally planned to record a different episode, but you couldn't find anyone to do 2001, presumably because everyone is scared of you. Yes, you. Man listening to this now, you, the person listening to this. What have you done? Take those tweets down.
I did find that interesting. There was I do find it sometimes when I ask people, when I offer the list of films that I'm covering to people, that sometimes people avoid the big ones. And I think Kubrick particularly has such an aura about him and such a weight and such a fandom that there is perhaps an innate fear of, I don't want to upset the... You know how people are like, I don't want to say anything bad about Taylor Swift because the Swifties is going to come after me?
Yeah.
I don't know what... Does the Kubrick fandom have a name? The Cubies? Will the Cubies come
The
first?
Cubs.
The Cubs? Oh, that's
Pretty cute, no?
Yeah.
I don't know that I think they won't kind of attack us in the way that a Taylor Swift fan would sort of, dox us and email our employers with nudes that they've hacked from our phone. But I think what they will do is sort of condescendingly fact check.
And listen, let's...
Not to alienate my audience straight out the bat. Hello, good listeners.
I think what's interesting about the conversation we're about to have, preempting, that will definitely be interesting, is that not that interested in the facts.
Rarely, if ever.
No. Really interested in the themes.
Vibes.
Vibes.
I said when I got here, I was like, I'm excited to talk about this vibes-based film in a vibes-based fashion and ignore what minimal plot exists.
So before we get into the film itself and how it relates and how it's influenced technology, tech horror, and science fiction movies, and pop culture at large, really. What is your relationship with the films of Stanley Kubrick?
Okay, well, just throw me to the wolves.
Yeah, let's go for it.
I actually don't think they're that good. No, can you imagine?
No, I can't leave my house right now.
So I think I was thinking about this, anticipating that you would ask me that question. I think I know that the first Kubrick film I saw was A Clockwork Orange at a slightly too young age. And I think I thought of him for quite a long time as a sort of, almost like a sort of provocateur type character, partly because of that film, but just his other work that I then saw didn't really contradict the idea that he was kind of boundary pushing and very interested in violence, very interested in kind of pressing buttons, which is not really how he's thought of. He's thought of as being this very meticulous, perfectionist character who has this obsessive attention to detail. And that's definitely something I came to value about him later in my journey. I would say probably 2001 might be the film that kind of made me appreciate him as one of the great masters of his medium and his art. It's very hard to think of people who are on that level who just, even in a film that I don't love the whole thing or I think it's imperfect, there will always be these flashes of pure genius that you could never imagine coming up with yourself, or that are just handled in this such a deft and expert fashion. And I guess sort of 2001, the most obvious example would be you sort of, I don't mean to start on a negative note, but you do slog through the prologue, which is too long. It is long, no, it's like 20 minutes of...
I genuinely can't think of time when I think of 2001.
It's pretty long. And then there's this sort of, you're kind of thinking, or I am I in this? Am I getting into this film yet? And then there's this like work of staggering genius, which is the cut from the bone to the satellite. And you're like, okay, well, fine. I guess I'm incredibly invested now after complaining in my mind for the last 20 minutes. And I think his work is, funnily enough, that for me, it's sort of, there are patchy moments, but then the brilliance is so peerless, which I think is the opposite of how a lot of people think of him. They think of him as consistent and, never swerves from the mission in a Hal-like fashion.
That's interesting. I think the popular image of Kubrick is almost as enormous as his films, but I think you're right, like they conflate this image of a genius kind of in retrospect. And the meticulousness and kind of the legend of him, of his pre-production, of the levels of research that he was doing, of how maniacal he was about controlling every aspect and hiring kind of experts in these different fields is so much larger almost than the films themselves. But the work stands on its own 2 feet. The work is peerless. And it is, I think, almost like a personality test with someone to see what their favorite Kubrick film is.
Interesting.
You can tell, I think, a lot about a person depending on where they land on a Kubrick film, because I think what's really compelling about him and makes him peerless is that his body of work, I'm talking about kind of his masterful work, the early tries, his early films that he kind of disavowed later on are good, but they're very clearly the first stabs of a very young filmmaker, and in a system that was not ready for someone like him for his approach to cinema.
He requires a lot of budget because he fires almost everyone at some point during productions.
And he requires a lot of time and doesn't really like doing scripts in the way that the studios needed him to do scripts. So like he didn't really fit in the old studio system. And that's fine. Like we got as much from him as he was able to give us as a public. And every single one of his films is so singular. Like there's obviously trace things that feel like his, but if you look at it as a whole, every single film tonally, visually is so vastly different. You can really just be like, are you a Clockwork Orange person? Are you a Doctor Strangelove person? Are you a Lolita person?
And if so, farewell. It's been lovely.
Are you a 2001 person? Are you a Shining? And I think like because he dabbled in so many, not dabbled, because he just dipped his toe into each genre and kind of perfected it to such an influential degree. You can love Kubrick, but very often our ideas of Kubrick really stem from our favorite Kubrick film.
Okay, yeah. What's your favorite Kubrick film?
I would say
We're on a horror podcast, so.
My first one was A Clockwork Orange.
Yeah.
So, and I think similarly to you, I thought of that as such a controversy. I understood it instinctively through its imagery, through what it was adapting. I then read the book and kind of saw also the work of adaptation and how interesting that was.
Yes.
I also saw him as a provocateur until I then discovered more of his work. I would say my favorite Kubrick is Dr. Strangelove.
Interesting.
I think it's funny as shit when he wants to be funny. And I
think
love
he's funny in all of his films.
Interesting. Well, we shall discuss in this one as well.
Yeah. There's humor. There's humor to be found if you look for it.
Yeah, but I do think that one of the things that it really comes through, and especially in 2001, is that the visual language adapts itself to the genre and to the story that he wants to say. And I think he is, as ridiculous and reductive as this might sound, he is a filmmaker who wanted to create a vibe in the audience. He wanted people to take a feeling away from the film rather than overanalyze the plot.
I think so, but I mean, we're probably going to be jumping ahead because I'm sure you want to talk about how the film was received, but I do find it interesting that he spent so long with this film obsessing about scientific accuracy and trying to predict the future of how technologies were going to develop. And the fan base that he initially found was just hippies who were stoned and had no interest at all.
And I can tell, not from personal experience, allegedly can tell, this film, 2001: A Space Odyssey, is two different films if you're watching it under the influence or not.
Yes.
It's incredible. But we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves.
Sorry, yes.
Where do you think, overall, in big picture terms, does this film stand in overall pop culture?
It's a small question for a small film.
Go for it. Give me a small answer.
It's kind of monolith, isn't it? It is the alien monolith that appears again and again throughout history. It's interesting to think about. It has been obviously referenced and parodied a lot, but I think what's fascinating about rewatching it is that you sort of forget immediately as soon as you're back in the film that you've seen the kind of like jokey impression of Hal, and you've seen the one scene that does take me out a bit is the opening stewardess, Pan Am stewardess, because the shot of the pen in the air has just been redone so many times in so many stupid ways. But outside of that one moment, which is kind of the only bit he didn't really predict very well, it feels still kind of like it exists. I don't want to say it feels contemporary because it feels like it just exists out of time.
Absolutely.
And outside of its own impact in a way. Because despite the fact that people have obviously been heavily influenced, nobody's really recaptured the tone that the film has and the pacing that the film has, so that whilst you might recognize the iconography, you've never seen the spaceship floating through space to classical music done quite like that.
Or
with that magic touch. Or just 10 minutes of nothing.
I mean, the boldness
of
this film is insane. And I think there's these elements where it's been so referenced, so over-referenced by everything. I think it's one of those cases where we know the reference before we see the film, but the references can never substitute the experience of watching it. Because even now, even though you've seen its legacy reflected in so many other films, horror, sci-fi, The Simpsons, Barbie, everywhere, nothing can really prepare you, even if you rewatch it for the upteenth time, for that opening shot of just black and silence, of the cut from the bone to the satellite, of the images, of the lights, of just the simplicity of the design of Hal, of the voice, or even like the lack of dialogue. Sometimes every single time I rewatch this film, I just forget about the pacing and how many shots there are of characters doing things and not speaking.
I think that's a part of what allows it to resist feeling cliche and overdone, is that even if you're seeing images you're familiar with, you're not hearing people say dialogue that feels out of date. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit, but the fact that there was originally this whole voiceover planned to run throughout the whole film, and he recognized this is not going to age well. This is going to ruin it. And it's difficult to have that level of ambition and self-belief that you know your film is going to last decades and you need to take anything out that's not going to travel in that way. But I do think that that's what he did. So despite its kind of shadow that it's cast over the way we view. Okay, so here's another thing. Obviously, this came out a year before the moon landing.
Yes.
And so it's quite difficult to separate the general space race hysteria and the sort of 1960s isn't the moon and spaceship fun vibe from this film. So I find it quite difficult to know what I think of as a 2001 reference and what was just in the air at the time of like, are we going to go to the moon? You know?
Yeah.
Because that's so set in that specific era before all of us realized that, oh, okay, well, the moon's there, but that's about it. It's not really worth going back. Apologies, men who care about space. But it's very set in that time, right?
Yeah, no, it's completely linked with the space race, but also I guess like this big cultural obsession with the last frontier, with being able to reach a different planet. And interestingly, I hadn't realized this even until prepping for this episode, that there was no image that we had of the Earth from above. So the first image that we had of planet Earth was from 1972, which was a few years after this film came out and many years after Kubrick was prepping it. So when we see those images of the Earth in the film, actually they don't really look that much like Earth does.
Right.
And you don't really notice it because you're obviously completely immersed in the film. But I think it also is it's kind of approximate. And that is just such a bold move to imagine the entire planet and how to visualize that and the enormity of it. And at the same time, its tininess in the enormity of the universe.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I knew that.
Yeah, I didn't know that either until
Thanks, Stanley. We got a fact.
But talking about Stanley, where does this film land in his career? Where was he when he started working on 2001?
So this is kind of the start of the masterpiece streak, right? So he's just had Dr. Strangelove. He's just been received with huge critical acclaim. He's now the guy everyone wants to work with. He's given enough budget to make this movie. And it was a flop initially. It was like a huge disappointment because it was supposed to be his big follow-up to that film. But yeah, it's definitely, it's kind of interesting to see from Dr. Strangelove, he doesn't put a foot wrong for like the rest of his career, really. So I guess it's a confidence thing. There's nothing like being critically acclaimed to be like, I could imagine what Earth looks like from space. Yeah, I'm just going to guess in a weirdly accurate fashion what technology everyone has.
I'm going to hang out with one of the best science fiction writers of my generation and all generations and just imagine what, like, you know, alien life forms might look like and what that might mean on a cosmic and existential level for all of humanity.
I think for that reason, it really feels to me like it's a late career film. Like, it surprises me that this falls so early in his filmography because it does feel very kind of what Francis Ford Coppola was trying to achieve with Megalopolis, doesn't it? It's like, I'm just gonna fuck it. No rules. I'm going as big as it's possible to go.
I actually kind of disagree. I think it does have the boldness and the arrogance of a young person. And I'm not saying that as a bad thing. Like, I'm always envious. Like, you should go bold. You should go for like, I'm going to try to do the thing that is never been done, that is impossible. I'm going to try to imagine the future. I'm going to try to imagine Earth. So on that note, how, and again, this is a big, wide question because this is a whole season focused on tech horror. How do you see technology being portrayed in the film?
Well, I guess that's a question about the whole film, isn't it? Because it's basically, that's what the film is the core theme.
Yeah.
Yeah, set up from the beginning in like a not particularly subtle fashion of like, look, apes inventing things. Millions of years of history.
Maybe aliens, question mark.
Maybe aliens, question mark, exactly. Well, we'll get to the question mark, I'm sure. But So I guess, again, just to go back to that original voiceover, it seems like the intention, and I don't want to dwell too much on the intention because it's not that interesting, but that original voiceover, by all accounts, was like, this is a centrifuge and this is how it works. And this is like, I don't know, hibernaculum, or I don't know what that is. It's just a science word.
Just science words.
But really kind of quite intricate scientific description. So I don't think that he was particularly subtle in establishing like, the theme of this film is technology and how it, what it says about humanity and does it set us apart from the animals, etc. What I guess is interesting is that we see these kind of millions of years of progress, but really, well, this is a question about whether you find the film optimistic or not, and I don't particularly, but I think I'm quite unusual in that fashion. It doesn't really improve their lives very much, right? It's kind of progress for the sake of progress in a way, it seems. And I think the element that got removed from the film that I find most interesting with that original plan is that the ship was supposed to be a nuclear ship. So technology was weaponry, basically. It's defined, they make a weapon out of bones and then you switch straight to, we took it real far and we invented nuclear weapons and now we're in this weird stalemate. So technology in the context of the Cold War is kind of this thing that's created almost a safety net of nobody can attack each other because they'll destroy the entire world. But it's also, that's not a good thing. It's not great to reach that extreme level of a cage, basically. And that's what it is for them, right? They are on that ship. They are either literally frozen and asleep or sitting about experiencing very little of life, running in literal circles, playing chess against a computer, not really talking about anything. It feels like a life barely lived. So I find the technology in the film to be very claustrophobic, personally. What do you think?
That's a really interesting choice of word, because the way that it depicts like space travel, particularly like in the third element and even the final chapter of the film as well, is quite claustrophobic. Like, it is lifeless. It's very advanced. It's very detailed, but it's very silent and there's not that much going on in it. It's completely removed from human touch or emotion. And I think the attention to detail that is placed on the production design it's one of the things that sets it apart. It feels so timeless. It feels so, it seems simplistic, but it feels like futuristic in a sense that it's like, oh, everything is perfectly clean. It functions very well. It maintains life. It allows us to travel through time and space. It looks really chic. Like, even now in 2025, when we're recording this could absolutely exist now. And I think it's something that contemporary sci-fi films don't really have, where everything just looks a little bit too shiny. This looks, for lack of a better word, matte. It looks like it exists and it's touchable and it's built. And a lot of those sets were in fact built and were in fact designed in partnership with engineers and scientists to look like they could function and to be taken as seriously as if they were really sending something out to space. I think that lived-in quality is still very metallic, very claustrophobic. But because if you ever see the inside of a spaceship, that's what they look like.
Yeah, for sure.
They're not fancy. They're not comfortable.
But it's interesting that you pick up on that kind of almost sterility by that portion of the film, because it's not there throughout. I think the further the technology progresses, the less humanity is present. Ironically, by the time we have any real characters that we know, it's how the computer has the most personality. But in the sequence on the moon base, you still have those touches of what is more familiar to us as kind of living in the world. So you have the sort of like silly joke about the zero gravity toilet, and you have the kind of the guy who Skypes his daughter or whatever it's called. And I don't know why I said Skypes, like it's, I don't know, 2016.
I mean, he predicted Zoom.
He zoomed, he teams.
Never.
You know, there's a lot more familiarity. Even when they're just kind of having, there's the posh English bloke who's like, right, righty-ho, is there like an epidemic or what? You know, the guy. And obviously everyone else is like, oh, this guy again. But then to contrast it, you then have a birthday phone call from family in the Jupiter mission, which is just met with almost like a shrug, and are like, oh yeah, thanks guys, whatever. I'm going to go back to eating my bland food and having my bland conversation. Well, no wonder Hal went mad. These people are not interesting.
No, but also I actually like, if we want to talk about the characters for a bit, I actually found it really one of the most involving elements of the film. And again, it's something that maybe because it transcends kind of pop culture in this enormous way. I always remember them having more personality than they actually do. And then every time I rewatch it, I'm like, I don't actually need them to have a personality. No. They are at work. They're doing work. They're doing their science space mission, whatever that is.
They're sciencing.
And I think there's also this personality type, very analytical, very calm. Like even when Hal starts going rogue, which we'll discuss, Dave is never is there a drop of sweat on his brow.
Right.
He doesn't blink. He doesn't freak out. He doesn't have like a self monologue motivating him to do what needs to be done or to get rid of Hal. It's all just analytical. What is the situation? What can I do? And implementing it. Mm-hmm. And I think that is also this very strange pacing of the film where stuff is happening. Like there's quite dramatic. Like there's murders.
Yeah, a load of stuff happens, but it's all met with this kind of zen
clinical
blank
approach.
Expression.
Yeah.
Or in Hal's case, no expression. Yeah, which makes it feel very glacial and kind of surreal.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's worth us discussing what is actually happening on the Discovery. What is the mission that they're there to do?
Am I supposed to know what the mission is?
Are we supposed to know as an
audience? Are they supposed to know what the mission is?
I think this is one of the great kind of MacGuffins of the film.
Do we find out? We don't find out, but kind of at the end with the message where he kind of is like, I'm finally going to explain what the mission is, and then it gets cut off, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think we ever understand at all what they're supposed to be doing. There's the implication that it's something to do with the alien monolith that they found on Mars or Jupiter. They found on Jupiter. Mm-hmm. And that's it. That's all you got. It's very important though, and it's very important to Hal, which is all that matters. The mission.
We'll get to this in a second.
He has a lot of enthusiasm for the mission, Anna.
He loves the mission. What is the mission? We'll never know.
Believes in the mission, passionate about the mission.
He is a corporate man through and through. He will never defy authority.
Man.
I kind of love that the mission absolutely does not matter.
It's not important.
It's not important at all.
It's space related. Nothing in space matters.
It's science.
Yeah, whatever.
I do love the fact that the monolith is like this mythical thing that we know is something that whatever the administration is, the corporate powers that be, the people who own and fund the space traveling are clearly very obsessed with, but we don't actually know what it is. We just know that it is power and it is awe.
Aliens.
And it's aliens.
It's aliens.
Yeah, but we never get to see the aliens. And I know there was a plan at some point to design humanoid-esque aliens.
I think they went through a whole design process, didn't they? And then, quite rightly, he was like, this is a bad idea. Someone should have told M. Night Shyamalan.
But I love the monolith as kind of the way that I interpret it. And I think it's completely open for interpretation. And there's no right or wrong way. Going back to what you were saying before about technology as well, it's like the monolith is the symbol of, it's the cost of discovery and of knowledge. It's almost like the apple. Yeah. It's like, well, we'll show you how to use tools, but it also means that you're now discovering violence. And this like placid, society that you've got going on here is ruined because as soon as you have the bone as a tool, you'll also discover and use it for murder. And then we know what happens next. And the same, and Hal in a way is an extension of that. Hal is also the bone, right? You create this super intelligent, allegedly infallible supercomputer, and then he does a murder
in space. It'll never sink. They've never sunk before. It'll be fine.
So I think it might be worth spending most of our time
Okay.
talking about Hal,
Our boy.
our boy Hal.
Yeah.
We are here to talk about machines. So, and I think Hal is probably one of, if not the most influential AI in cinema.
Yeah.
So, how would you describe Hal, and why do you love him so much?
I think that when I was watching this over the weekend, I texted you saying, why does Hal behave like a petulant child from a wealthy family? He's like, the kid is basically, he's always getting praised, you know, because he's so good at everything and he's never done anything wrong. And neither is any other Hal. And so he's constantly being told how great he is. Isn't it such a shame that you have to work with humans? And he's like, oh no, I don't mind lowering myself. And then as soon as things start going slightly wrong with him, he's like, excuse me. Excuse me. Dave, I think I deserve an answer to that question, Dave. Dave. That's not very kind, Dave. Dave. Stop, Dave.
Dave.
Dave. My favourite Hal quote is, Dave, this conversation serves no purpose.
I
Sort
mean,
of a shady little bitch.
have I ever said that sentence?
Oh, and there's also a bit where he actually goes, he's watching Dave do something. He goes, just what do you think you're doing, Dave? Which is hilarious.
You should take a stress pill, Dave.
I really
seem
think you should calm down.
I really don't think you're making a wise decision
Don't
right now,
gaslight me,
Dave.
Hal. You're trying to kill me. Don't tell me to calm down.
I don't think, I'm going to go in a limb here. I don't think Hal is the villain.
No, well, okay, so let's take Hal seriously for a second.
Yes.
Because, you know, if we want
just as seriously as he takes himself. That is what we're going for here.
Yeah, so Hal, I think the whole point of Hal is that he is, he is taught by humans in the way that AI is taught, which was very prescient of Kubrick to figure out how he would do that. He is the product of humanity, so all of his personality quirks are just human stuff that humans have taught him. It's not his fault. He doesn't have free will. He's a computer. And so he just reflects back all of humanity's best and worst qualities, including our capacity in the end for human error. And that is the beginning of his undoing, is that he makes a human error despite being a computer, and does not take well to his own failure.
In a very relatable mood.
Yeah, it's, if every time I embarrass myself by making a mistake at work, I was able to have a meltdown and murder everyone in my department, well, it wouldn't be better, but, my life would be different. And I think it would be fair.
So, we're not the first people on the internet to debate, does Hal malfunction, or is Hal actually very good at his job because his job is to protect the mission at all costs?
Right, yeah. So there's the two camps, right? And I think, for me, I'm not really interested in the malfunctioning thing because that's that's a science. I don't care about science. So,
we've established it. You don't like technology and you don't care about science.
I think I'm much more interested in sort of almost like a third camp, which is that everything is not calculated and he's just doing his job well. He does go mad. But it's not like a computer malfunction. It's a human. It's the humanity in him drives him insane. That's what I think about Hal.
So what do you think Hal wants? Because this is something that as I'm watching...
He wants to do his job, Anna.
He wants a gold star.
He wants everyone else to stop being so damn incompetent.
Hal, you and me both, buddy. My God.
I think
he wants Dave to love him.
Do you? Okay,
No,
so here's
not really.
I don't think he does. I don't think he cares about Dave. And why would you? But I do think he speaks to a very kind of human anxiety about identity and purpose. I think that when we're introduced to him, it's very clear this is HAL 9000. He's in charge of everything. And he's very good at being in charge of everything, and he never gets anything wrong. And he comes from a long legacy of HAL 9000s. He's got a great breeding, this computer, and they've all done never anything wrong ever. And this is where they exist within the universe. And they're on the BBC, and everyone knows it and understands it. And as soon as he steps outside of that very clearly defined kind of identity and reason for existing, that he has a meltdown. So,
literally.
It's a literal meltdown. It's a very human response. He becomes immediately can't accept that it was him, becomes suspicious and paranoid, is spying on his colleagues.
Yes.
You know? It's all human, very human behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of what he wants, he just wants to belong, like all of us.
That's a very sweet interpretation of him.
I feel like he's a psychopath, Ruby.
I mean, I think it's a very corporate kind of psychopathy, because even everything you've just described is like, he thinks he's certain in his own ability, in his own competence. He's certain that his accomplishments, his breeding, as you say, makes him particularly apt for his job. And then he has to work with these two dudes, and they do not CC him on an email.
They're pretty basic.
Yeah. And what he does is what everyone who's ever had a corporate job will have done, and don't pretend like you haven't, is spy on your colleagues' calendars to find out if they were in a meeting that you were not invited to. And what could that mean? And that is Hal trying to lip read his colleagues while not turning his little red blinky light on.
You're so right.
It is that. It's corporate politics. And it's particularly tense because there's just 3 of them. So really, if someone is not included in a meeting, you know exactly who it was. And then he does go a bit berserker. He's like, I don't understand. I'm so good at my job. I'm better than you. Why was I not CC'd?
Why was We need a racy so we can all understand our roles and responsibilities here, because you are stepping outside of my boundaries.
And also, what do you do then if you're someone like Hal, which is a petulant child with impeccable... Well, I was going to say, you try to prove how much more competent you are than everyone around you by essentially setting them up for failure. In this case, failure means death. Which is unfortunate.
See, that'll show you. Well, you're drifting off into the infinite.
Which is why I think he gets so annoyed when Dave, who's the other one, instead of reacting in a way, it's like, oh,
Thank you
how?
for clarifying, because as you know, I find it hard to tell them apart. Dave's the one who doesn't die.
Dave's the one who doesn't die. Dave's the hot one.
Okay, I think they're both the hot one.
I think Dave's hot one.
I've got a lot of room for more than one hot one.
Well, Dave is the one with the tiny white shorts, so
Okay,
immediately he's the hot one. And when Dave does not, I think he wanted Dave to react with awe. He's like, oh, I see how good you are at your job.
What a great murder.
Yeah, it's a perfect murder, in
Very
fact.
good murder.
Yeah.
Well done. How?
Exactly. Let's move on.
Let's move on.
I will never not CC you in an email again. Instead, he's like, I'm going to disconnect you. Rude.
Extremely rude.
Very rude.
Extremely rude.
So what do you do? He gets fired when he was the only one who was really concerned about the mission.
He is the only one who cares about the mission.
We don't know what the mission is.
No.
But Hal is the only one who cares about it. And I wanted to talk about I'm pro Hal.
And we care about it by virtue of caring about Hal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What do you think about the characterization of Hal? I know it's difficult to talk about it when it's like becomes so iconic, but it is so simple. And I think the voice is the biggest element of Hal, obviously.
Yeah, so actually I'm trying to veer away from behind the scenes trivia with anything Kubrick, because as we've discussed, it's just an endless like mountain of things. But one of my favorite behind the scenes trivia things is around the voice of Hal, because they originally hired an actor to be on set, and obviously he got fired because it's a Stanley Kubrick production. So he got his AD to step in and be the voice on set. Do you know the story?
No, I don't actually.
And his AD is from East London. So the Hal that they filmed with sounded like Michael Caine.
Stop it.
Nothing like the current one. They had a Cockney Hal on set, and none of them heard the real Hal that they dubbed in afterwards until the film premiere. And apparently the actors were like, what the fuck is this? This is not what I was expecting. I've been used to this like cheeky chappy.
I mean, would it be scarier if it was a Michael Caine?
It's hard to say, isn't it? It's hard to say. Yeah, so the voice is scary.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think it's in part because it's so non-threatening by design to the extent that you don't trust it. So like, why are you being so softly spoken and calm, Hal?
Corporate culture.
Dave, stop. Dave.
Let's circle back to that, Dave. We have identified a problem, Dave.
We can offline this problem, Dave. Dave, I think you should calm down. This isn't the appropriate forum. Fuck you.
We can set up a separate email for that. Let's do a working group about that, Dave.
Oh dear. So I love the voice. I think it's great. Yeah, it's just spooky enough, and he really pulls off the switch, which, you know, has been dissected a million times. We don't need to dwell on it too long, but the death scene is so incredibly poignant and funny. Like when we watched it together, and we were laughing at the Dave stop, Dave stop, Dave stop. But then suddenly we both stopped laughing because it wasn't funny anymore, because he was scared. And he started being aware of his own mortality, which is not very computer-like behavior. And the voice performance is really strong in that moment. He really injects a lot of pathos into singing A Bike Built for Two.
And I think it's also a moment where Dave is...
Dave.
I think it's a moment where Dave also realizes that he's not just disconnecting a computer. He's also ending a form of intelligence. A form of intelligence that he doesn't understand and obviously has become or is fundamentally malignant, or that does not prize human life above the mission as it becomes clear. But I think the really poignant moment is when he encourages Hal to sing.
Yes, it's so beautiful. And I saw the actor describe it. He compared it to the final scene of Mice and Men.
Oh,
when which also has a murder. He said for him it was exactly the same kind of feeling of he's not, at that point, he's not killing Hal to protect himself or anything like that. He's putting him out of his misery because he has lost sight of what he needed to do, and he just needed to be cut off. So it's almost like an act of mercy at that stage.
I mean, I love that from his point of view. However, I disagree.
He is wrong, though.
Yeah, he's absolutely wrong. And shall we discuss the murder that Hal commits briefly?
Yes. Well, he commits quite a few. Because he kills all the frozen people.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
I never think of the frozen people.
They're barely people.
That's true. But it's chillingly efficient.
He does kill like 5 people, yeah.
Yeah. He basically puts them in the recycling bin
He drags it on from his desktop. Yeah. And then you hear the little... That wasn't a very good recycling bin impression, but you know the noise I mean.
Yeah, and it means death.
It means death, yeah.
Yeah. And where do you think that all the murdering that Hal does happens because he made a mistake, allegedly? We know Hal never makes mistakes, but these pesky humans were telling him that he had made a mistake, and he was like, absolutely not. And in fact, you shall all die.
Yeah,
before I admit to it.
I do think it's an inability to accept that he's made a mistake, and that just completely throws all of everything that he knows. And as I said before, he instead of kind of recognizing it, he externalizes, and it has to be their fault because it's a human error, right? And he's not human. Yeah. So if there's been a human error, the threat is the humans, and the humans must be stopped. And again, relatable king, he does not at any point entertain that he may have been the problem.
But I think it like if we really go into like the existential element of it, which I think this film is all about, without pointing fingers at it, on the surface it's just like malignant evil AI, right? But if you think about it a little bit from Hal's perspective, it's like, what does it mean if you are an infallible super intelligence and you commit a mistake? That would fundamentally throw your entire existence into disarray. Yeah. You'd be like, what does that mean? If I'm not infallible, then what am I? And if I made a mistake, can I do other things that are not the things that I'm programmed for? What does it mean to have free will? It means to commit murders. Yeah. But, you know, you could argue...
In Stanley Kubrick's world, it kind of does. Like, anyone with freedom's probably going to do some murdering. And if you try and constrain them, like Alex in A Clockwork Orange or, you know, like Johnny, it'll come out eventually and they're still going to do some murders. It's inevitable.
I think what's also interesting is like, and it's kind of a roundabout way as well to my next question about the influence of Hal, is... This is an idea that I think is central to tech horror, particularly with tech horror or that deals with artificial intelligence, which is, what do we create it for? Do we see it or respect it as a living thing? And in turn, does it see us as a living thing? Does it see us as less than because we're less intelligent than it? Does it see us as more than because we're alive and we can make choices? There's another film that we'll talk about later on in the series called Demon Seed, where there's another evil AI. And that, light spoiler alert, that AI's motivation is to have a legacy, i.e. have a child, which is interesting. And I feel like if you look further on, even a few years after this film, something like Westworld, which we'll also talk about in the series, we create AI or humanoid AI to essentially enact all of those human vices like murder on them without feeling like we're actually murdering humans, but something close to human. So when I think about them next to each other, I'm like, well, what if Hal just sees humans as non-living things because they're not the same as he is? So he's just play acting what it might be like to have free will and what that might mean. But of course, he's also susceptible to death or disconnection.
Yeah, I mean, he at the end of the day, he's not human and he doesn't have morality. So that is, it's impossible to be a malicious computer. You can't be like, I really want that person to suffer. That's not a thing that a computer would experience.
That's a radical idea.
But what I like about the very minimal dialogue in 2001 is anything that's in there, it does give you a clue. And I really like the interview that Hal does, his little BBC interview, BBC 12. He's like, hello, I am the star of the show.
He's media trained.
And he's asked, do you resent that you have to rely on humans to do your work? Mm-hmm. And it's this kind of perfect example of the human characters projecting what they would feel onto this machine, because they want to kind of they want to revel in their own cleverness. Like, we made life.
Yeah.
And okay, I'm going to veer slightly off your question here and go to what I assume will be your final one, which is what is 2001 about? But to me, it is a film that is about hubris. And there is nothing that represents hubris better than believing that you can be a god and you can create life. And so when we treat a computer like a human being, which, to be fair, the astronauts don't until everything starts going wrong, and then they start projecting all these human qualities onto him very quickly, by the way. Like, he makes one mistake and they're immediately like, I don't trust that guy. Like, immediately, within seconds.
Again, corporate culture.
They do not trust that guy.
Corporate culture.
We need to go sit in this pod and come out.
Make one mistake and all of a sudden you're disinvited from the goddamn group meeting.
Yeah. But you get the impression that this society is kind of wanting interviews with Hal as if he's a celebrity, but he's not. He's a computer. I can't remember what my original point was.
That it's a film about hubris.
It's a film about hubris, and I can talk more about that if
yeah, go for it. I think it's really interesting.
I guess mainly, the title is a clue.
Yes.
It's called Space Odyssey, and the Odyssey is a book about hubris. So, I've not expressed great genius by making this leap. Hal was originally called Athena.
Yes, I did know that, and you love Athena.
I do love Athena, but I also, as a deeply non-religious person, I do enjoy any work that's about humanity getting back in its box. And not thinking that we're better than nature, and recognizing that there are forces at work that are beyond our understanding. And we see that in 2001, right? We do have a higher power. We have gods, but they are aliens, and they're manipulating activities throughout the film.
Taking a step back, what do you think of these connections with classical Greek and Roman mythology? The Odyssey, Athena. I mean, obviously that was changed and gender flipped, but what do you think about the initial and very evident connections to those myths?
Yeah, so I think Kubrick commented on it. I can't remember the exact quote that he gave now, but he said that he was imagining that the experience that ancient cultures had kind of journeying out. Typically, you can imagine Odysseus in his ship with his men on his endless torturous journey to try and get home. But anyone in that era exploring, quote unquote, colonizing, was the closest thing that he could imagine to people reaching out into space and kind of going out into the unknown for the first time like that. So I think it's something that he probably drew from quite heavily. It doesn't have as many monsters as most of the classical myths do, but I do think that you have these ancient godlike figures.
Mm-hmm.
And even the design around the monolith is sort of speaks to classical design a little bit. And the final sequence is very Baroque. So yeah, I think it's a deliberate allusion.
So tell me your thoughts, and I'm not trying to put you in the spot. I don't want to put myself on the spot. I deeply believe that there is no right answer for this question. But what do you think happens in the final sequence?
I think the most kind of viable theory that I've heard is the wormhole theory, that he goes through a wormhole. Because it's scientifically accurate, of course it is.
Hey,
even though nobody knew wormholes existed,
he
it was still
consulted with
somehow,
Carl Sagan.
like he's consulted with a future oracle. I think for me, it is the godlike figures intervening and saying,
Mm-hmm.
"All right, that's too far now. You've invented something that murders people with its own, because you've given it a mental breakdown through your own weird culture on this spaceship. So that's enough for you. You've peaked for what you can achieve in this form,
Mm-hmm.
in the same way that like the apes at the beginning reach a peak and then they become humans.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's sort of the versions of humanity that we witness. So I think the ending is like, that's humans done now. Time for a new thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be giant babies.
Giant space
Giant babies. That's the only obvious next step, is giant babies.
I love that.
What do you think it is?
My interpretation is kind of similar in the sense that I do think it's a stop and a start for humanity. So it's essentially like we're seeing the recycling or the beginning of the next evolution of humanity into giant space babies.
Yeah, it's the only way we could go.
But I think it's also it doesn't leave me with either a pessimistic or an optimistic feeling. And I never thought about it as like the gods are interfering. I always thought that it was a connection to an alien power in the universe, and our inability or our own small-mindedness or, lack of knowledge of the wider universe means that we don't know what it looks like or how it communicates, and we can't really understand it. But it's giving us enough things to try to make us catch up, and we've just not caught up. And the final sequence where we see Dave kind of in this weird Baroque kind of liminal space looking at himself age, I think is a metaphor. It's not really Dave, it's just man. And it is this sped up ending of humanity. And we could argue that it feels more prescient or even more claustrophobic now, when we're literally on the brink of a climate disaster, when politically everything seems to be falling apart, and we're in this phase of trying to convince itself that it's normal, but it's very much not. And it's this kind of like, let's isolate ourselves. And I think the fact that we just see this one man eating steak, sleeping in a king-sized enormous Baroque bed.
Well, he's the final girl of 2001, right? He's the last human standing.
He is the last human standing. But I could argue, like, when I was watching it kind of with 2025, I like very pessimistic eyes on, I was like, is this a world where there's a lot of these pods?
Mm-hmm.
It's just humans sitting in these like bought for, perfectly insulated, perfectly climate controlled, kind of eternal liminal spaces where they can live. But to your point earlier in our conversation, they're not really living. This is not a human experience.
Yeah.
You are surviving. You're physically alive. This is not life. And when it comes to an end, the monolith appears again. And it really feels like the end of humanity. And the next stage is giant space baby
time.
But I do think there's something really... And I read a couple of pieces about Kubrick being really interested in how... Not to sound kind of like all vampiric about it, but like, what does it mean for man to continue existing after death? I mean, this is the great thing, right? How do we...
Vampiric.
How do we exist past our human physical lives? Can we transplant our intelligence into an artificial body? Can we maintain it in some way? Is it just our work? Is it our family? Like, we don't need to get existential about it, but I think that is a through line in the film. And
I love this because I feel that this is, again, in the same way that you can tell a lot about a person about their favorite Kubrick film.
Yeah.
I like the idea that Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke were kind of like a yin and yang duo, in that Arthur C. Clarke is fundamentally very optimistic, very kind of like enthusiastic about technology and gadgets, and then Kubrick is Kubrick, and he's generally pretty bleak in his outlook.
Yeah.
And it seems like the response to the film is quite similar. Like, you've got a lot of people who really see it as kind of beautifully life-affirming and inspiring, and kind of take the meaning to be that you just have to keep looking for the truth. You're not going to find it. We're not going to give you any answers. It doesn't matter as long as you're the Dave and you keep trying. And then there's me, who's like, you should be Hal and shut it all down. Stop that.
But I think there was something, I do think that Kubrick in his life was a really humanistic, a homey kind of person.
Yeah, I don't mean, he's bleak in that he's in tune with the darker sides of humanity, but he's definitely like in tune with humanity.
But I think this film, for, to make it like a really simplistic point, the fact that there is no warmth in it makes you want to give someone a hug after watching it.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't, the way that I come away from this film is not feeling isolated or bleak, but rather it's like this sterile, claustrophobic, contained life is not life. Like, this is not what
completely removed from literally planet Earth, but the natural world that we sort of start the film in.
And also
gone.
People.
Yeah. There's no like touch at all in this film, is there?
None.
No.
None at all. Unless you count when, Dave murders Hal
he's
by
pulling
being
out
inside
all
of him.
Yeah.
He's literally inside of him.
What a way to go.
I know. I made it weird. I'm sorry. Remember that time when you...
all of his like neurons and stuff out of
Remember the time when you literally floated into my brain and pulled out of all my neurons out and killed me?
Hell yeah, I think about it all the
Hot.
time.
I think you mentioned Arthur C. Clarke, and I mentioned him a little bit before.
Yeah.
But I think it might
Cutie
be worth...
patootie.
He was a cutie. I think it might be worth, just as we gear towards the end, to talk a little bit about those two very different sensibilities, these two very different men coming together to create this absolutely peerless, timeless masterwork.
I like that they based the concept on a short story that failed to win a competition. It's very cute.
Relatable.
And I also like that that Kubrick, who again was not the most established man in the world. He was still in his 30s.
Yeah.
Wrote to this titan of science fiction, and then had the audacity to be like, if you could just write a novel based on my screenplay, and then wouldn't even let him release it for ages.
No.
The cheek.
They kind of wrote it together, sort of.
They wrote it together, yeah.
But
only, I think, because Kubrick kept interfering.
Well, they were like, they hung out for years, which I love.
I
really recommend that listeners check out a piece that was written by Arthur C. Clarke years after, that was about their coming together and their meeting and how they worked together on creating it, and what he called, and I wrote this down, stimulating disagreements.
That's what we have.
Constantly.
Cute.
It's very cute.
Cute.
And I don't want to spend too much time quoting, but I do just think that this is his introduction, Arthur C. Clarke's introduction to Kubrick, in his piece, which you can read on Vulture, and I'll link in the show notes. I think this is a beautiful description of this man.
Yeah.
Kubrick arrived on time for our first meeting.
Already getting brownie points.
And turned out to be a rather quiet, average height New Yorker, in parenthesis, to be specific, Bronxian, in his early 30s. He was clean shaven, though he has since grown a full-fledged beard. The main impression I gathered and still retain from that first meeting was of a restless, probing intelligence with an unbounded curiosity about the universe. Kubrick would have made a good scientist. He insists on knowing how everything works and grasps new ideas, however complex, almost instantly.
Why does this sound like a school report?
It does, doesn't it?
And he always contributes politely but intelligently to class discussions.
I do think there's something really shady and also delightful about the fact that he mentions
average height,
but punctual.
Also, kindred spirit, because these two men love attention to detail. Didn't you tell me that Kubrick had so many notebooks about the making of 2001 that he had to start new notebooks to organize his previous notebooks?
I do not see an issue with that whatsoever. Highly relatable, perfectly normal.
We could have had a whole section dedicated to kind of Stanley behind the scenes, just weird stories, because he is a peculiar character. But maybe there's a whole other podcast episode.
That's an After Dark.
Yeah.
That's a bottle of wine John Ronson's Kubrick's
That's the one
boxes
we have
in the
privately,
background.
and none of the listeners are allowed to join.
Well, maybe we can...
Unless you become friends with us.
You can subscribe to the Patreon. I can post them there.
I'm not exaggerating when I say I don't know what that is. To bring this conversation full circle. What's a Patreon?
I'll explain it to you.
Okay, yeah, that's another episode. It's just Ruby finds out what a Patreon is. And dissects whether or not it represents hubris.
My Patreon is only full of beautiful people who love movies and talking about movies and horror books.
Okay,
And
so I'm not invited.
No.
We've descended into silliness, Anna.
We have.
Descended.
Let's wrap up the silliness by... This is perhaps a silly question as well.
Hit me.
Why do you think people should watch this film right now?
Well, you've done something there which is... it's very media friendly, which is you've asked me to make this film feel relevant to our current moment. And I'm not going to, because I politely think that it's a staggering work of genius that transcends time and culture. And it has remained every bit as relevant today as it was when it was made in 1968, and it was in 1970 and 1972, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So watch it because it's one of the greatest films ever made. There's an argument to be made that it's the greatest film ever made. Don't try and make it relate to your own life too much. Just let yourself languish in the existential angst or joy of it all, depending on your personality type.
And you've done something very media friendly as well, which is give me a perfect soundbite that I won't have to edit at all. Excellent, all around.
Do you want to answer the same question?
No.
No?
Timeless work of staggering genius.
Yeah. Go off, Stanley.
Yeah. I would only just say, don't let the film broy fandom of this film in particular, and Kubrick in general, put you off. Because this is a film that even the most hater of haters cannot find a reason to hate.
It's true.
It is genuinely that good.
And as we've said, there's very little plot for them to correct you on when you're discussing it.
I think the main thing that people need to remember is that this is a vibes film.
Mm-hmm.
And the vibe is awe.
The vibe is awe, yeah.
The vibe is awe for
Yeah.
2001. And Ruby, before I wrap up, is there anything else you wanted to say about 2001 that we have not covered?
Yes, Justice for Hal. Hal Innocent.
It's a t-shirt coming soon to the Final Girls website. Justice for Hal.
I also think it's nice to tell the listeners that my Wi-Fi network is called HAL 9000.
I think that's beautiful.
I am loyal to the core.
I didn't know that, and I've been to your house multiple times. I think Hal being always in the background there, unassuming,
yeah, and I like to
efficient.
think that one day my own house might murder me.
I think about
God,
that often.
please.
In fact, my house is trying to murder me, but that is for another podcast.
Yeah. It's ghost related. Anna's just having a moment of realization that she's haunted.
I don't know by who.
Mind blown.
Anyway, Ruby, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Again.
Always a pleasure. Where can people find more of your work, online or in person?
You can't find me online. Please don't try. You can write me a letter, courtesy of BFI South Bank, if you want to send fan mail there. That would be delightful. I am a programmer at South Bank, so I am regularly in the guide. There you go. That's really old school. Get the printed guide and look for my name.
Go to a physical building.
You can probably, I suspect
guide.
if you Google me, it will come up with some events, but I would never do that because I don't hate myself. So feel free to come and tell me that I was wrong about a particular moment in 2001.
But never about how.